I only have about 40 minutes, and so there will be times when I'll skip over some things. I'll just try to get to the juicy stuff that might be fun and interesting, but I think there'll be enough here to whet your appetite for this growing area of neuroscience and its implications to presentations and preaching, etc. This will be a chapter in my book that's, Lord willing, coming out. But so if you're, I feel awful doing this, but I've done it, so there we go. There is a chapter in my book where I talk about this, so for more information you can go there. But again, there are other books that I've read. Unfortunately, I just discovered, I've spent about a year reading a variety of books and journals and medical journals, and some fun, some not so fun, frankly, because I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a doctor that cannot save anybody's body. I might be able to help with your soul, but then I walk in on my daughter. They like watching Netflix, and they watch different programs. And she turned on to this new thing. Hey, Daddy, you're doing some work in the brain, right? Like, yeah, I am. There's a show called Brain Games on Netflix. Have you seen this? So we watched one episode. I'm like, I just spent 3 months reading on that. And this guy just explained it in 5 minutes. It took me forever to, I don't get it. I'll read this, I'll read that. And this guy does it in like 5 minutes in the show. All that to say, if any of this interests you, just go to Netflix. Go to Netflix and watch this series called Brain Games. Fascinating. And actually much more interesting than my presentation can ever do. Because one, it's video, they have music and a lot of color and art, and many of the researchers that I actually read, they come on as guests on this show too. It's like, wait a minute, that's the McGurk effect. Hey, I spent like a month reading that. All that to say, the brain games on Netflix, very, very helpful. So, this lecture, this discussion begins with a simple premise. A simple premise that the design and delivery of sermons, or let's broaden it out, the design and delivery of presentations is just as important as the discovery and discernment of the biblical text. So just as we spend a lot of time in interpretation, understanding of the meaning of the Bible, and then trying to get at that meaning so that we can teach it, what's the point of having all this data that we've mined if we can't present it in a way that's actually worth eating? It's like a chef has all this great organic food and meat and veggies all at their store, but they have no idea what to do with it in terms of processing it, plating it, using the right kind of seasoning, what to eat first, what to eat second, etc. And for those of you that like food like I do, as you can see, a good meal is the presentation, the process of a good meal is just as important as the actual ingredients themselves. Does that make sense? So that's what I'm trying to argue here, is that design and delivery is just as important as understanding the text. Remember what it says in Proverbs 25:11? It says, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver. Or in a different translation, the right word at the right time or in the right way is like precious gold set in silver. Or in other words, good content, right? The true content we have from Scripture have great value, like precious gold, when they are designed and delivered, in this case set in silver, for maximum impact. Great preachers seem to have effortless delivery, but oftentimes with great preachers and presenters, behind this great, seemingly impromptu delivery is actually hours of agonizing design. One of the men I admire in terms of speaking ability is the late Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, take one of these great quotes that he gave. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. So here we have a master of language who understood truth, goodness, and beauty in language, and was able to spend hours thinking about the best way to put together his words and then deliver them for maximum, what I would call maximum attention, maximum retention, maximum integration, hopefully for transformation. And so I think neuroscience is one field that helps us design and deliver sermons, Bible studies, presentations for maximum attention, retention, integration, and hopefully through the power of the Holy Spirit, transformation. What's interesting is that many of Winston Churchill's friends admired him for his impromptu speaking ability, but they recognized that the secret was his hours of design and delivery. Winston has devoted the best years of his life to preparing his impromptu speeches. And so what may seem as impromptu, actually behind that impromptu, effortless, engaging eloquence is actually many hours in the study thinking about design and delivery. And so what I want to do is introduce you to 10 brain functions. I know that's 10. Many of them are very quick. Some of them will go faster than others. 10 brain functions that I've recently learned and their implications to preaching. All right? Now, before I speak, again, you have more functions than just 10, obviously. Your brain is a very powerful, amazing organ that God has given you. What I want to do is just give you 10 of them. And again, in this short 30 to 40-minute lecture, I cannot talk about every aspect of the neurology and the science behind these issues. What I want to do is just kind of cover over them as quickly as possible to get at the implications. Furthermore, much of what you'll hear, I think, will at first sound like common sense. Like, oh, that makes sense. That's something that I would do or somebody else would do, etc. But it's amazing how many preachers lack common sense. At least the preachers that go through my classes. And so in my dedication in the book, I actually thank all the students over the years. I've been listening to sermons for 15 years. And so I've counted about 3,000 to 4,000 mediocre sermons that I've now heard. So this preaching book is really a result of listening to about 3,000 mediocre sermons. And some really good ones and some not so good ones. So all that to say, I think there's much more that can be said, much that is common sense. And again, as you apply some of these principles and practices, it will be different because much of you are in different cultural and contextual there are differences culturally and conditionally. So having said those caveats, let's move on. All right, first brain function, character matters. Character matters. What do I mean by that? Brain research has shown that the hearer's perception of the speaker's character, not what he says, but how he comes across, that his character directly correlates to levels of attention and retention. If you appear to be credible, even though you have no idea what you're saying, you may be completely lost. If you appear to be credible and comfortable, trustworthy, safe, the hearer's levels of attention and retention actually increase. Brain research has shown that as audience members feel safe and comfortable, consider you trustworthy and believable, credible, their levels of attention, their levels of retention actually increase. That's why they say, even though you make a mistake, stay calm. There's actually brain science that goes behind that. Conversely, if you appear to be very nervous, and I'm shaking up here and my voice begins to shake, and I appear arrogant, untrustworthy, or insincere, it will be a very long 30 minutes when you're preaching for you and for your hearers because their attention levels go down, their retention levels go down, and there's actually brain research that shows that their brain actually shuts off. I'll talk more about that later. And that's why a lot of people sleep during my sermons. I'll be honest. It's not because they didn't have a good night's or they had a bad night's sleep the night before. It's because I'm doing things in my preaching, either in my delivery or in the design of my preaching, that causes their brain to shut down. And there are actual physiological reasons for that. Now, it could also be that they didn't get a good night's sleep, but that's besides the point. That we can't control. But as presenters, we can control certain things. So we want to maximize what we can control to have maximum effectiveness in our presentations. Character does matter. Speakers do well to demonstrate their integrity, their authenticity, their passion, their believability when they speak. So whether you like it or not, people start judging you, and I know you have too. People judge you even before the first words come out of your mouth. How you dress, how you walk, how you are introduced. All of that figures into the brain's perception of a particular speaker. And I'm sure you did that with me. That's normal. Now what you can do is take what's normal and maximize it for your benefit, or just ignore it and just say, I'm representing God, you better listen. Doesn't work always that way, does it? So establish your credibility and build rapport with your hearers, especially, I think, at the beginning of a presentation, especially at the beginning of a sermon. It's during that introductory moments where you want to establish that credibility. And what's interesting, when Dr. Robertson, who, by the way, gave a great presentation and no one clapped for him. So as we clap, we don't clap after sermons and things like that. That's not pious, of course. But we clap because we thank God for the gifts that God has given to this man and for his gift to the church. So thank you. Thank you, George, for that very helpful lecture. But as George was saying at the introductory parts of the sermon, one of the first things you want to try to do is establish that need. There's a reason why you need to listen to me for the next 30 minutes. Because what I'm about to tell you can change your life. And I believe that. If I believe that the gospel is so transforming, I want to say right up front, all of you have a problem. And guess what? There's a solution. And so as you begin your sermon or presentation, you establish that need, you can hint at or wave at, you hint at that solution. You're establishing your credibility as a speaker who should be listened to. Because you care more about them than you do about yourself. I'm not here for myself when you're preaching. I'm here representing the King of Kings as his herald, ultimately for your good. And I need to be able to present that at the very beginning of the sermon. You need to see that in my face, you need to see that in my eyes, in my body, and even in my language and my words. And you can control that. You're not being fake. If you believe it, which I hope you do, this is life and death issues, isn't it? The gospel is about life and death. And so you can speak with that kind of authenticity and passion. So character does matter. So in light of this brain function, a couple of principles. Oh, here's some pictures. A couple of implications. Dress appropriately. Maybe I don't need to say that to this crowd because you all look wonderful. But I have seminary students who are still working on issues like hygiene. These young men who are surprised that they're still single. Like, why am I still single, Dr. Kim? Well, you might want to wash your hair regularly. And not just wear sandals and shorts everywhere you go with a t-shirt. Nothing wrong with t-shirts and sandals in San Diego. But, when you're going on a date, you might want to clean up a little bit. Those are just common sense, right? Again, amazingly lacking in some of my students. So dress appropriately. And interestingly enough, I think this is one of the main reasons, or a good reason why ministers wear robes. Think about that, practically speaking. I know of a story of a preacher who didn't want to attract attention about what he wore. So he had 3 or 4 navy blue suits and 3 or 4 of the same red tie. So he would wear this every Sunday, red tie, white shirt, blue suit, every week. But it would be a different one. Right? Wouldn't be the same one. So he had a good goal, not to attract attention, because he wanted the attention to be on the message, not on the messenger. Sure enough, Christmas time comes around, and guess what he got for Christmas? He got several new ties, several new shirts, and a couple of suits from different members of the congregation, because he felt like, we're not paying him enough. So what started off as this desire to not attract attention, he got more attention because he was wearing the same thing over and over. Whereas with a ministerial gown, actually, not only does it elevate the office, you're representing the King of Kings as one of his officers and ministers. So I think there's a wonderful place for that. Again, it's contextually conditioned, culturally conditioned. It works in some places, it doesn't work in others. But I think historically that's why ministers wear gowns as well, because they want to dress appropriately, take attention away from that. Also in terms of communicate credibility and authenticity with your face and body. And I'll talk more about this as we get to some of the other brain functions. For example, you communicate credibility and authenticity primarily through your eyes. Think about when you're trying to tell your loved one that you're really sorry for being a jerk. I know what this is like. And for you husbands, boyfriends, wives, any one of you, you know, when you're trying to say sorry, can you imagine having it all written out, you know, and going, "Dear honey, I just want to begin by saying that I'm very sorry for what I did. And if you really believe me, you'll take this message of forgiveness to heart." Now, you laugh. You would never do that naturally, intuitively. You would look your loved one in the eye. Shakespeare was right when he said the windows are the eyes of the soul. Eyes communicate authenticity, credibility. We do that with our loved ones naturally. When you're talking to your children, that's hurting. Why would preachers or presenters just read from a manuscript? I'm not saying it's easy to memorize and to think about what to say, but you want to be able to show your credibility, authenticity, your shepherding instincts, your care, concern, and love for God's people, your spiritual children in many ways. And so those are different ways to communicate credibility and authenticity with your face and body. I'll give you more examples later. And then now, let's go to the second one. Ready, aim, fire. What do I mean by that? The brain function here that I'm talking about is that the brain actually goes through a 3-step process in order to understand information. For maximum attention and retention to occur, the brain, much like a gun, loads information. Then once that information is loaded, it aims for more like information. It's aiming. And once it finds the information that it's supposed to lock in on, the brain fires. That's how the brain works in terms of processing information, generally speaking. Much like a gun, right? Like James Bond. You load the bullet, you aim the gun, and then once you find your target, you fire. The brain does that with information. The brain loads info. It's called pre-encoding. The brain loads information when the brain is alerted to take notice. The brain then aims by looking for more of the same information. Then it fires when it acts on the information given. So what you want to do is you want to maximize that brain's processing way of doing things. That's the brain's process. Research has shown that the strength of our memories depends upon several things. And so if you want people to remember what you're talking about, etc., the intensity of the original firing, the number of repeated firings, and the relevance of memories. This is important because of the way the brain pays attention. Generally, the brain pays attention when it's either told to pay attention or it pays attention even though you're not thinking about it. They call this top-down versus bottom-up attention. Top-down is like me telling you, I'm going to tell you 3 things: faith, hope, and love in my sermon today. And then as the sermon goes on, I'm going to talk about faith, different aspects of hope, different aspects of love. Then when I start saying those things, your brain will fire on that information. And thus, your ability to remember what I said increases because I've pre-encoded your brain, and then I've talked about it and caused it to fire. What even increases even more, but that's all that to say, that's top-down attention. Bottom-up attention is when your brain is alerted when you're not conscious of it, like when you hear a siren go by. You notice it, but you don't pay as much attention, especially if it's regular. Californians, it's like that with earthquakes, actually. When an earthquake hits in the middle of the night, we kind of wake up and go, how big is this one? Is this the one? It doesn't feel that big. And you just kind of go back to sleep. You just get used to it. Or when a baby cries in the back of the room at church, you hear it, you pay attention to it, but you haven't been alerted to it. Or when you see a familiar face at the mall, you're walking through the mall, you see a familiar face, you go, oh, and you pay attention. Those are 2 different ways, top-down, bottom-up information. What's the whole point of that? You want to be very intentional in how you design and deliver your information in light of the fact that the brain operates this way. What are some preaching implications? Let me just move on. The goal is high return on investment, namely how much time you spent in terms of the words you use and how you deliver that. You want maximum return on that in terms of attention and retention. How? Let me give you some implications. Preview your points to help pre-encode the brain. And so you know how a lot of preaching books and professors tell you, if you're going to tell me, if your sermon has 3 points, tell me what your 3 points are in the introduction. Oh, that seems so simple. I want to be more eloquent and fancy. And I want people to try to figure out what my points are. Because you want to be more creative and fancy. I'll tell you what, they will never know what your points are about. You spend so much time trying to be creative, they won't even know. You've lost clarity. In your desire to be creative, you've lost clarity. Now, don't get me wrong, creativity is a wonderful goal to aspire to in preaching. Nothing wrong with that. But I'd much rather sit under clear preaching week by week where I actually understand what he's saying rather than, oh, that was interesting. That's very creative. What did he say? What did he talk about? What was the point of all that? I'm not knocking creativity at all. We want to be creative. But this is where in the introduction, I tell my students, if you don't preview your main points, your grade is already knocked down. You need to pre-encode my brain with what you're going to talk about in the introduction. Also, present your points in novel, unique, and repetitive ways. Nothing wrong with repetition. It's common sense, right? Repeat. Repeat it in different ways. Present your points in the novel ways. You can use surprises in your content, turns of phrases, poetic language, cadence in terms of your speaking. When you have a list of materials you want to give, don't just list it off like bullet points, but actually heighten your delivery, signal to your readers that something is important. We'll talk more about these ways of speaking that will help. There's more, but also illustrate using focused imagery. Illustrations are very, very important. I so appreciate George's preaching. He's such a great storyteller. And stories have this way of communicating truth that touch and stir the heart and the soul. Remember earlier I said you get more memory and retention when you have emotional relevance? Oftentimes when you just hear a propositional truth like God is love, God loves you, you'll say, yes, I believe in that. But when you hear a story, or God is sovereign, right? God is sovereign watching over his children. That's true. But then you hear a story about the hurricanes and Katrina that he went through, you're like, wow. Why? Because it touched different parts of your brain. And your brain is firing on the rational and the emotional, and it's going further into your long-term memories. And as it touches long-term memories that have emotional value to you, you start connecting emotional, relevant history to the point that's being made, and the brain's firing even more. So when you have good illustrations with a clear insight, the brain is firing. Have you ever noticed sometimes you won't remember the actual point of the sermon, but yeah, I remember the preacher gave this great illustration. You'll remember oftentimes the illustration. And that's how because it has that emotional relevance to us. So you want to design and deliver sermons and your material in ways that take advantage of the way the brain operates in this way. All right, let's move on. There's some other things too. If you're interested in memory and focused imagery on memory, there's a wonderful book called Moonwalking with Einstein. Moonwalking with Einstein was written by a journalist who was intrigued by a club or a group of folks that basically memorize. To give you an example, and they have memory contests. There are people in the world today, you can give them a deck of cards. I'll shuffle it up. You shuffle up the deck. You give them 30 seconds to flip over the cards. This is how fast they can do it. Remember, there's 52 cards. 30 seconds, that's about 2 cards per second, right? Then they give the deck back to you, and they can recall all 52 in 30 seconds. They've only spent 30 seconds memorizing. How? Through focused imagery. They have, in ancient days, speakers were able to get up and recite up to 3-4 hours of poetry. How did they do that? They used what's called memory palancing and focused imagery. And so what they do is you imagine yourself walking through a familiar palace or a house or a room that you're very familiar with, and every place you go, what these card readers will do is they put, like that sumo wrestler with the cape on, he's holding like the 3 of clubs in the first room. Then you walk upstairs and you see that lady with the bikini, and I think there's a monkey hanging on the wall. There's a lot of these different images. Or Einstein moonwalking, that's where the thing. So in his mind, he has Einstein moonwalking with the Queen of Hearts, the sumo wrestler with the Superman cape with the 3 of clubs. And they memorize 52 locations and 52 different images. Then they place that card with that person and image. And they're able to, within 30 seconds, memorize the whole deck because of that focused imagery. So this journalist, who was, I think, in his late 20s, early 30s, said, can I learn this on my own, or only special people like the Rain Man can do this? He actually learned how to do it in 1 year. In 1 year, he was able to accomplish that and went to the nationals. Meaning you have that ability as well to memorize that much if you put your mind to it, literally. So, all that to say, it's an interesting book. Third brain function. Third brain function is one at a time. Please, 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 one at a time. What do I mean by that? The brain, much like a conveyor belt, is a simple, self-organizing, self-maximizing memory system that likes patterns. The brain normally organizes information in a linear, serial pattern that is one information at a time. In fact, people process information better when you give them one discrete unit at a time. The brain is like a conveyor belt. It handles information units one at a time, contra what many people would like to believe, namely multitasking. Very, very difficult to multitask. There are few in the world that can do that adequately. Some incredibly well, but very rare. Very rare. People, what happens to most of us when we multitask, instead of a conveyor belt going slowly, what you have is like the baggage handler at the airport getting too much information, and what happens? It gets clogged up. Nothing moves forward. If there's no clear endpoint, all the information becomes a random mess. And thus, even though as a presenter or a preacher, you may have the best content in the world, a randomness of ideas leads to confusion and disorientation at best, frustration and disengagement at worst. So even with great content, randomness can lead to confusion, disorientation, frustration, and ultimately this. Why? Because for most of us, as speakers and preachers, we're instinctively what I call sender-oriented. We care more about what interests us than what's actually beneficial for our hearers. And so we design our sermons or our presentations based on the unique things that I've discovered, rather than how will this come across to the college student who thinks this way, with this kind of worldview, as opposed to an audience at my church. Very different. So you don't take the same presentation, the same content. You have to take into consideration your audience, how they process information, their worldview, their questions, their concerns. We have to be more receiver-oriented, not sender-oriented. And so we just load up our information. We go to seminary, we learn all this stuff, we just get all this information, and what we do? We spray and we pray, and we hope that somewhere out of all that mess they'll remember something. We show up and we throw up. And we pray that something will stick. Maybe something will stick. After all, this is God's word. More volume does not equal more value. And so, what are some implications? Be very selective with the information that you cultivate in your study. Be very selective. Select the material in your research in order to reach your homiletic destination along a logical and linear pathway. Please don't aimlessly ramble. If you give information that is not aligned with your pre-encoded direction, encoding the right information to arrive at your intended location is made much more difficult. So what you want to do is, after you do all your study of the background information on Habakkuk, you study all this stuff, then what I do is I go through a 3-step process. I ask myself 3 questions about all the information. I say, is this crucial as part of my sermon or presentation? Is it optional? Or is it non-essential? Is it crucial? Then somewhere in my sermon it's got to be there. Or is it optional? If I have the time and the space, maybe I'll put it in. Or is it non-essential? It's true information, it's good information, but it doesn't help me achieve my goal for my sermon. And once I do that, I have 3 piles. Non-essential pile goes in one folder. I could use that later in a Bible study or some other material. And then I look through my crucial and my optional, and I design my sermon based on that information. So that's what I mean by be selective. Be simple with your ideas. Simplicity, clarity, obviously. Be simple and clear with your supporting material. Complex words, abstract ideas, long sentences will tire your hearing. Unlike reading, we'll talk about that next. The difference between getting information through the eyes versus getting information through the ears. Ears are much more limited. You can speak and listen to about 150 words a minute. No, we can listen to 200 words a minute. You're not going to remember much. But you can adequately read about 200 words a minute and actually retain quite a bit. And that's why when you're writing something, like a research paper, it's very different from putting together a sermon because of the way that information is processed by the hearer or the reader. We'll talk about working memory or short-term memory. So be simple. Be succinct with your words. Make sure you choose conciseness in light of capacity. That is, what they can actually hold on to. So let's talk about capacity. What's happening with the brain? Brain function number 4. Head, heart, hands. What do I mean by that? When you listen to a sermon, when you listen to a presentation, even as you're listening to me, the primary part of your brain that's listening is the prefrontal cortex, which is right behind your forehead. The prefrontal cortex is the primary area that is being activated when you're listening to a sermon. Now, the prefrontal cortex is amazing. It can do a lot of things. You can write, as you're doing right now, you can write, listen, feel the temperature, all at the same time. Some things you don't know you're doing, like breathing. Some things you know what you're doing, like writing and listening. All of that is being controlled through the prefrontal cortex. Not all, but a lot of that. The prefrontal cortex takes care of things like abstract thinking, reasoning, evaluating, but it also handles your emotional impulses of whether or not you like something or don't like something. It includes making choices between right and wrong. And so the prefrontal cortex actually connects the rational, the emotional, and the volitional, the head, the heart, and the hands. Brain research shows that when you present information, you want to present information that's connected to all 3 areas of the body. The cognitive, the emotive, and the volitional, or the thinking, the feeling, and the willing, the acting. And so our sermons need to touch upon all 3 areas for maximum attention and retention, hopefully for integration and transformation to occur. So you don't want to just have brain-heavy information. You don't want just heart-heavy information, not just hand-heavy information. You want to connect all 3 for maximum because that's how the brain operates. Furthermore, when people listen to their sermons, they're using what's called the working memory. Just emotional relevance, I've already talked about that. When people listen to sermons, they're usually working through what we call short-term memory or working memory. The working memory involves several stages in the brain. I won't go into all the details. All I'm going to say is when you listen to information, the likelihood of attention and retention increase when that information heard through the ears has emotional value. So just think about that too. Also what it does is as it receives new information, it's automatically, this is how your brain works, it's automatically trying to connect it with things you already know in long-term memory. And so this is where knowing your people comes handy. Analyzing your audience, knowing their histories, knowing their experiences. That's why good preachers are also good shepherds. Because people who are shepherds know the hurts, the anger, the joy, the sorrow of their people. They know their histories. They know what has touched them, what has hurt them, what gets them excited, what makes them sad. And so they know their history. So as preachers, you're thinking very carefully, I have this particular truth. How can I connect it to them? You'll have more likely attention, retention, integration when you connect what you're saying in the short term to things that have been in the long-term memory. So think about that also. But the brain is also very limited. Take, for example, these string of letters. Try to memorize as many as you can right now. How many did you memorize? 6, 7? All? Did I hear all? Name off some of them. How did it start? How interesting, huh? So you're remembering things based on patterns, right? Did you know that the brain, based on its limited working memory, can only memorize about 7 discrete numbers or letters or ideas? That's why phone numbers today, many years ago prior to smartphones, had only 7 digits, plus or minus 2, because that's about the maximum number that you can memorize in short term. 7 discrete units, unless you put it into a pattern. See all this? If you try to memorize all of those at once, it's very difficult. But then you break it up into a pattern, then all of a sudden you can memorize all of them. Can't you? So if I, again, shut it down now, you know all of them, right? How many sets were there? Yeah. See how easy it is to see? Now, oftentimes we present sermons and Bible studies like this. What we want to do is present Bible studies that look more like this, based on how the brain processes information and based on the limited capacity of our brain. People cannot receive as much information as you would like them to receive. So you have to be smart. Brain science. You have to be smart about how you design and deliver your sermons. You want to maximize the capabilities of your audiences. So in light of that, what's the point? Maximize the capabilities of your audience's working memory. I don't have time to talk about that too much. Let me just give you some of the implications. State relevance early. Remember, first off, I said the head, the heart, and the hands are connected in the prefrontal cortex. So what you want to do is at the beginning of your sermon, tell them the emotional value of what they're about to hear and not just the rational truth of what they're about to hear. Not only is something true, but why does it matter for their conviction? So this is where you start making the difference between facts, values, and policy. How to live, right? So in your presentations, am I answering those questions of fact, value, and policy, or the head, the heart, and the hands? And making sure that our presentations have all elements of that. Let me move on. Apply each critical point. Oftentimes, I don't know if you've ever heard sermons like this, where you spend 30 to 40 minutes just describing all the background information and all the things related, let's say, to the David and Goliath story. So you're listening, David was like this, Goliath was like this was the history of Israel, this is all this background. And 30 minutes later, after this history lesson, now let me give you 5 applications. And I want to be careful what I say here, because I used to do that, and maybe some of you do that. That's not the most effective way to help your listeners connect the head, the heart, and the hands. What you're asking them to do essentially is pay attention to everything I've said for 30 minutes. And then when I give you even just one application, I want you to remember all 30 minutes and show how it connects to that one application. Unless you're an amazing speaker, it's very difficult to do. And so what I teach my students is when you get to a critical point in your sermon, at any stage in your sermon, and you think it's an important point, apply it right there. One of my Welsh preaching professors' name was Howell Jones, who was taught by Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. Howell used to say in his wonderful Welsh accent, strike while the iron's hot. I can't even do it right. That was so embarrassing. But now you remember it because it was really bad. Strike while the iron's hot. And as you're talking about a hot point, strike. Strike. And so that's what I mean by apply each critical point. Use illustrative materials to connect to emotions. Help connect truth to emotion, resulting in more attention and creation. Now, having said that, does that mean, Julius, are you telling me that I just need to tell 5 stories and then preach the truth? Of course not, but you just heard me lecture on preaching the gospel and doing justice to the text and the original author and all that stuff and all the background information, as well as the gospel, the need, the supply, and the response. What I'm saying is, as you're talking about the need, as you're talking about the supply, as you're talking about the response, insert illustrative material to connect the head and the heart, essentially to the hands as well. Choose words that engage the whole person. I mentioned this earlier. Select sentences and ideas that help the listener connect truth in real, concrete, and vivid ways. Focus on common human experiences. There's another way of saying focus on heart issues, common heart idols that we all face as humans in this sin-cursed evil world. This is largely because while you may know your congregation and are able to tailor your messages to their experiences and their history, sometimes it's hard to do that. So focus, go deep into the heart. Focus on heart issues, and then find creative ways to repeat and pattern critical points and themes throughout the whole sermon. For me, this is one of the best ways for me to show the beauty of the gospel from the text. Once I figure out how the gospel is connected, what I call, Bryan Chapell has what's called the FCF, the fallen condition focus. I introduced a new word, it's a CFC, the Christ focus connection. You like that? You like that? So when I'm talking about the Christ focus connection of the text, I try to choose a theme or a motif in the text that I'm going to weave throughout the whole sermon. This vine that's in the text, vine that's in the the Bible, I try to create like this motif, this thread. So I introduce the thread up front, but I don't say it's going to be Jesus or the gospel. Then I come along and talk about it again, and then when I get to the end and I actually explicitly talk about the gospel, and then it's just very powerful in terms of remembering for the hearer. All right? All right. I'm out of time. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I got through 4. 4 is better than 3. I don't know if you knew that. So what I'll do is, let me just go one more. I'll just do one more brain function that might be helpful for you. There's a lot of good ones, but you just have to get the book for that. Let me just do the next one, 5. Look into my eyes. I already mentioned the importance of eye contact. This is look into my eyes. What's the brain function here? Neurologically, hearers of sermons, hearers of presentations and Bible studies, neurologically experience the same emotions being presented by the performer because of what we know of as called mirror neurons. Babies learn this at an early age. They start to mimic, before they even understand language, they're able to mirror what they see, right? You all have experienced this, I hope. Your hearers are much the same way. They've done research where based on certain emotions being emoted by the speaker, they had these brain things wired up in the hearers, the same parts of the brain were firing in them. When there was like anger, then the anger neurons would fire in the listener. So what's the point of all that is this? The speaker's passion and conviction will impact reception and retention. Again, common sense. But eye contact and facial expressions are more important than you may have realized. Research has shown that the intensity of the stimulus influences how the brain pays attention. So in light of that, what are some implications? Researchers have shown that for maximum impact to occur, you want to spend about 1 to 2 seconds per eye. Now, in a group like this, it's very hard for me to make eye contact with every single person. Now you're watching me and how I'm looking, right? Now you're paying more attention. Interestingly, isn't it? And so what they say is they say spend about 1 or 2 seconds or about the length of a sentence or a discrete unit of thought. And what I try to do is, if I've looked over in this area, I focus on George for 1 or 2 seconds, then I'll go to that area and I'll focus on that person. And even though the people around you are not looking at me, the fact that I'm gazing with you, I'm engaging you, makes me more credible. Rather than, maybe you've seen speakers that when they look, they talk like this, and as they're talking to you, they'll do this. And for a short time, it's okay because you think, oh, maybe he's thinking of something, he doesn't know what to say, so he's really pondering. But after a while, if they continue to do that, and they're trying to say something very, pastoral to you. And this is why, friends, you need to really trust God when you go through those difficult moments in life, where sometimes you question God's integrity. So believe in the gospel and remember how important it is. It's almost silly. It seems silly, right, when I do it? But a lot of speakers do that without even knowing. You may do that without even knowing because of nerves, which is normal when the adrenaline goes up. But there's ways to actually use adrenaline to your benefit. So there's other things you can do. So spend about 1 to 2 seconds on each set of eyes. And if you're not sure what to do, this is where videotaping can be very helpful. If you're just learning how to present in front of groups, have someone videotape you in a live setting and see some of your habits, like your body language. Let me go to another one, a signal degree of emphasis. One of the best things you can do in terms of maximizing attention and retention is creating moments in your sermon where you force the listener to lean in, quote unquote lean in. And what I mean by that is this. If I were to start talking in a whisper, slowing down, talking slow, pausing longer, all of you, it's dead quiet in the room, isn't it? It's dead quiet in the room. Why? I've just made you lean in. He's doing something different. I've signaled to you he's doing something different. I need to pay closer attention. So I've created this kind of lean in moment where you're not physically leaning in, but emotionally you're like, oh, what's he talking about? Why am I doing this? I don't even know why I'm leaning in. But he just made me lean in just by talking slow. So a lot of people, a lot of young preachers think that to be an effective, emphatic preacher, you got to talk really hard and really loud all the time. And it doesn't matter what I'm saying. It's in fact not very emphatic at all. I'm just going to talk about my trip to the store where I learned about the difference between salt and pepper. And so preachers think that if I talk in this way, I'm being emphatic, when I'm not doing anything at all. And so it can be just slow talk like this all the time, like this, monotone, mono-pace, mono-everything. Or it can be just high intensity for 30 minutes. And what happens is like that guy who was sleeping in the pew, that's what will happen because the prefrontal cortex gets very tired. And when it's overloaded with information that's irrelevant and frankly annoying, the brain actually shuts down. That's why you physically feel tired. For example, have you ever felt tired after an airline flight? There are physiological reasons for that. Your brain is working overload in trying to dampen the 90 or so decibels of the engine noise. That's why when you travel, one of the first things you can do is actually put earplugs in your ears. By decreasing the noise level, your brain is not working as hard to try to shut it out. Your brain works naturally at shutting out distractions like noise. But while it's doing that, your brain is only 2% of your body weight, but takes 20% of your glucose levels, your energy. So when it gets to depletion levels of that 20% depletion levels of glucose, your brain goes, I'm done, I'm shutting down. And that's when you go, and that's why you get tired, because your brain shuts down due to various reasons. Whether it's things that you cannot control, like the noise of an airplane, or a really poorly designed and poorly delivered sermon. And so you want a signal degree of emphasis. So you don't want to create too many lean-in moments. Like what I'm about to say is very important. Wait, the next thing I'm about to say is really important too. And wait, actually this third thing is really important too. After 20 important things, it's like, what's really important, right? So you want to purposely design in your presentations moments where you want your audience to lean in. What I call those is when you make the turn from exposition to application. You're explaining, and you say, what does this mean for you? What does this mean for me? And you make that turn, that kind of pastoral turn. And I want to shepherd you now. And so you create that lean. Now listen very carefully to what I'm about to say, people. This is what God wants for you. And then you say, now that you're done with that, you lean back. You go, now let me tell you a story. I remember when I was 7 years old, I learned the lesson the hard way of trusting my parents. And immediately, how do you feel? You're already starting, I can see it in your faces. You're already starting to smile, relax. Why? Because your brain is not going to be working that hard. So I've created a lean out moment where you can kind of relax in your chair emotionally, so it gives your brain cognitive rest. And you need to build into your sermons places where you have cognitive rest, because the brain is going to be on overload getting too much information, like today, like these lectures today. That's why having those 45-minute breaks or 30-minute breaks are very important, just to give your brain time to rest, because your brain is very limited. Lastly, show passion and emotion when appropriate. That goes without saying. I've mentioned that quite a bit. But it's important for us when we present, especially something as true, good, and beautiful as God's Word. We want to show our passion, our intensity, our energy, but that can be done in a variety of ways. You and I both know that you can convince people not just by yelling at them, but you can just do it with a simple, God spoke to Elijah in a whisper and persuaded him in a whisper. So you want to vary the different skills and gifts that God has given to us in terms of our delivery communication abilities, and use them for His glory and for the good of God's people. Thank you for your patience. I know I've gone over my time, so I appreciate it. Thank you.